everyone, this is Lomi, and today I guess I'm starting a new series because I get a lot of questions about the digital work I do for my dolls and stuff. I am very much a novice when it comes to digital sculpting, and a lot of the time I spend in Blender is kind of spent fumbling around with trying to remember where my tools are and what my hotkeys are, and trying to get Boolean functions to work right because Blender is great, but it's also kinda janky sometimes, let's be honest. So between me not feeling qualified to teach anyone how to do what I've been doing and not having the memory capacity to remember my buttons, the best thing I can do is instead share some diaries of what I'm working on and share a peek into the choices I make and why. So in this video I'm making hands. There's nothing special about my method. There are lots of great tutorials for this from people who remember what their hotkeys are, but I ended up needing a new pair of hands for Little Rune because the ones I sculpted for Rillin weren't quite the right size. Rillin is a standard mini and Little Rune is a slim mini, so he's a bit smaller. I recorded part of the process of making him some hands using Blender, and that's kind of what I'm sharing here today. So I started with a box because every Blender file starts with a box, so I just kind of flattened it and used a loop cut, thinking at first that I might extend the little finger out from the side like I did for the thumb, but I decided not to do that and just moved my loops to the middle and curved the hand a bit from there. I first started doing 3D sculpting when I was making Rune's head. I ultimately finished his head by hand, but he started as a Blender sculpt, so this is something I've been fiddling with on and off for years, but I've never really taken the time to learn how to do things effectively. Effective is not really what a lot of my workflow is, because I spend a lot of time changing my mind and just kind of rolling forward instead of moving back, but it's what works well for me, I guess. Extending the fingers is just a matter of grabbing the faces and extruding them. Blender likes squares, so I try to keep everything boxy early on. I make the thumb with 2 extrusions. You can do that with the fingers too, but I did them as 1 for some reason. So instead, I use the multi-loop cut to slice them up. You just use the loop cut tool and then just hit 2 or 3 or whatever you want on the keyboard, and there you go. I use the rotate tool to bend the fingers a bit, selecting the faces and rotating them and moving them back and forth and down and whatever. And yes, because someone inevitably always says something about it, I am aware he has 4 fingers. I did not forget any. That was not an accident. The character actually has 4 fingers, and that apparently really throws people for a loop. Weirdly enough, he's also got 4 toes, 3 forward and 1 back, and nobody seems to think that's bizarre, but I get enough people asking why I made his hands wrong with only 4 fingers that if each of them gave me $1, he could have some really nice jointed hands instead, so it is a choice. I know there are only 4. I did that on purpose, I promise. Anyway, after he has his hands roughly shaped, fingers bent a little to show me where the knuckles will be, I use a subdivide modifier to subdivide the hand into like 50,000 square faces, so it's a good geometry. And then I switch to sculpting mode to start altering the shape. I love the sculpting tools because I get to use my tablet and just draw in 3D basically, shape his hand however I want, and I really probably ought to use a reference for it, but I don't because I am just not that responsible of an artist. I should be able to draw a hand from memory, right? So I draw in creases and ridges in the back of his hand where bones and tendons are. I shape the fleshy part of his palm and the webby part between his thumb and hand, and build up a lump where I'll stick the ball joint. And because I'm lazy and it's effective, I use the snake hook tool to just drag claws out of his fingertips. Clawed hands are a lot easier to me to make than hands with fingernails, so I think this worked out really well for this character's hands. I spend most of my creation time in sculpting mode. I do shaping and reshaping, refining his hand, smoothing things out, making adjustments to placement and angle using the grab tool, and just sort of dragging things around. When it's time to add a ball joint for the wrist, I just make a UV sphere, eyeball the size in relation to the rest of his hand, smooth it out, and leave it in place for now. I'll merge these two shapes later with a Boolean union modifier, which fuses the two while erasing the interior geometry, so this will be 3D printable without a lot of cleanup. But the Boolean tools don't make very clean geometry, so it wouldn't be good for building shapes most of the time. There are better and more professional ways to cut holes into and fuse pieces, but I honestly don't do enough 3D modeling to justify taking the time to learn to do it unless I decide to do something like make an entire doll at some point, which isn't really on my list of things to do, especially now that I'm pretty much out of room for dolls in my studio. I have heads to make, and I'll be sharing some of those in the future. I'll be sharing a look at something I've done for one of them in the next few weeks most likely. But I don't think I'll be making any bodies unless something really weird happens someday, or I get some stupid idea like making fashion-sized versions of Rune and For All, which I definitely mentioned to somebody last week, but I definitely don't intend to do because that's a whole lot of work and not something that I have time for right now, especially when I have so many unfinished projects that need my attention. I'm trying to wrap them up a little bit at a time, and this is one of them, but he's getting close. Honestly, I think the most fun part of sculpting his hand was working on the palm. I really liked drawing in the crease lines and the fleshy shapes there. The wrist ball ended up being a little on the large side, but I'm not going to redo it because it's just for me, and my opinion is that it's good enough like this. I wasn't super thrilled with the positioning of the fingers, so I ended up grabbing them and moving them a little to soften the pose of his hand a bit, and you can see I just smoothed out the union of the wrist ball and the rest of the hand with the smooth tool. The wrist was made with two cylinders, one stretched out to be a long oval, and I used that to cut out the wrist with the Boolean difference modifier, and the wrist peg is just a cylinder turned sideways and merged into the wrist. The union modifier didn't want to cooperate, so I just used join, and if there's messy geometry inside the wrist ball, I don't really care because it doesn't affect printing. I originally thought I was recording this part, but I guess OBS crashed at some point and I didn't notice, so that is unfortunately lost in the ether of digital space. But the next problem was that I also needed a forearm because I want to keep human parts for my dolls too, right? So I had to sculpt a forearm. Because of how finicky Blender can be when working with subtractive shapes, I decided to build the base of my arm in Tinkercad, and this is what it originally looked like. Tinkercad is great because it makes primitives super easy to use, and you can actually get pretty far with it. This is a totally functional arm piece as it is, and you can see it's just built out of basic shapes fused together. The arm is a paraboloid stretched out super tall and then cut to length using a cylinder as a whole. There's a cylinder hole down the middle to create the elastic channel, a sphere hole to create the wrist socket, half sphere and warped cylinder to create the elbow socket, and then I used a little half cylinder fused with the paraboloid to create the little lock nub. After I exported this from Tinkercad, I took the file into Blender and used the sculpting tools to give the arm a little more shape, which also made the elastic channels a little wonky, but it's fine, it's not visible. These parts printed without needing any special alteration or doctoring, so they're ready to sand, primer, and paint. The only problems I encountered were that I made the elastic channel and the arm too small, so the S-hooks don't fit into the channel, and as a result his wrist ball doesn't fit into the wrist socket just yet. And also the elbow socket is too big, but I'm going to address this by just drilling out the wrist, and I'm going to put epoxy into the elbow and call it a day, since these are probably the only set of these pieces I'm ever going to need. Unless I break one of these, I'm not planning on casting more or having more variations. This is like a one and done kind of project. All in all though, I think it turned out pretty well, especially since this was my first time sculpting hands. And that's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.